Hello and welcome to the first video lesson for cinema aesthetics. This is a very brief introductory session and it's to give you a chance to start thinking about some of the ideas that we're going to discuss in more detail in the live class sessions which begin on the 8th of October. So the question that I'm going to address in this video lesson is one that we'll keep returning to throughout the course of the module, and that question is, how do films work? Can we identify a particular pattern, the particular techniques and mechanisms that are consistently used regardless of the particular kind of film, whatever genre it belongs to, whatever cycle of films in film history it belongs to? Perhaps there's something that's common to most films that we can use in our attempt to analyse films to get a clearer understanding of how they work for us. And we can extend that question of how do films work by thinking about how films engage our attention, perhaps as the first stage. How do they grab our attention? And then the second stage is, how do they keep our attention? And finally, how do they satisfy our attention? So engaging, retaining, satisfying attention. If we can answer some questions about how those aspects all come together, then I think we'll get an idea about how films work. And hopefully this is going to be something that you're going to find useful in your creative practice as well as your theoretical work, because you're making short films and you need to know how those films work. And arguably the patterns that we'll find with longer form films will be very similar, if not identical, to those patterns in short films. So to begin with, we might start with obvious lines of appeal that attract us to movies. So I've got a list there of things that all occur to me as elements that I look for. I'll look for a film with particular performers in it. I might have one or two performers that I very much enjoy. I enjoy the work of those performers and will look for all of their films. Or I may look for a film because it has a particular kind of action. For example, it has extremely violent action in it, and I'm a connoisseur of violence in movies. There are many lines of appeal, and if you look at that list, they kind of add up to a trailer for a film. These are the kinds of things: the star being active in a romantic clinch, involved in spectacular, often violent confrontations. Those elements are often compressed into trailers, but they don't necessarily explain how the film that they're trailing works as a cinematic experience. So I think we need to find something that ties all of these elements together. And perhaps you're sitting watching this and thinking, of course we're looking for something that ties these things together, and that thing is the story. And to give you an example, we can see how the story brings those elements together. My example is one of my favourite films, Con Air, in which we have a star, Nick Cage. There are other stars, John Malkovich, John Cusack, others, but perhaps Nick Cage is the key star, key line of appeal. He might be, for example, I didn't know the director of Con Air, Simon West. I went to that film because I liked Nick Cage from his previous performances. So Nick Cage, the star, is a prisoner trapped with other prisoners on a plane, and the prisoners take over the plane. So the action, violent action, in fact. The characters and the action are often kind of bizarre, tongue-in-cheek, over the top. There's a lot of humour. There are also moments of heightened emotion, especially in the romantic relationship that is underlying a lot of this story between the lead and that character's partner. And of course, if you know Con Air, you know that it ends fabulously as the prison plane crashes into the strip in Las Vegas, and this huge conflagration, exploding aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of dollars flying in the air, people scrabbling for the money. It's a fantastic spectacle. So there we've got, very briefly, a summary, and it's kind of, I think, close to how you might explain that film to your friends if you've watched it and they've not seen it. You might say, well, this is what happened here. It's got Nick Cage in it, and he's a prisoner, and there's these really ridiculous characters, and there's a big plane crash. You know, a kind of jumbled version of the story. But even then, that story doesn't really explain how the film works. And I think to get closer to an understanding of how the film works, we need to think about the form that story takes. So the next level that I want to encourage you to think about is how the story is within a particular form, which we call the narrative form. Okay? So this is the argument for this lesson, that most films organise their stories, and there are a million stories, but those stories tend to be organised within similar patterns of narrative form. So the narrative is the bigger entity, and into that narrative we can pour the story, the plot points, character development. We get what happens and how it happens, and we'll talk a lot more about how the story happens in future weeks. So, what is the basic pattern? And here we're dealing in quite simple terms, I think. The basic pattern that we find across many stories in cinema, we could look to other art forms, but we're concentrating on cinema, is the pattern of an equilibrium followed by a disequilibrium followed by a different kind of equilibrium at the end. So I've got a quote here from one of the key books for this module, which I'll talk about more in the live lesson. It's Warren Buckland's Teach Yourself Film Studies. And Buckland says, an initial state of affairs is introduced and is then disrupted. The narrative is then driven by attempts to restore the equilibrium, which is finally achieved at the end. Okay, so Buckland there expresses a pattern going from equilibrium into disequilibrium, followed by a final different form of equilibrium. And we'll find this regardless of the genre. We find that in horror, in gangster movies, detective movies, in comedies. So I think it's an important point of understanding that we should come to terms with in the opening week of our first session in cinema aesthetics. I think it's important to note that the equilibrium of course, is the introduction, but it's more than that. It serves to define a state of ordinariness or normal life for this film. That doesn't mean that it is positive. It might be the normal life of people in prison. Before Disequilibrium, which is the introduction of action that leads to the breakout of the prison. Before that is developed into a restoration of equilibrium, which might be prisoners living a free life, or it might be prisoners restored to their status in prison, but with some kind of transformation. So equilibrium at the beginning doesn't mean a happy or positive state of affairs, and neither does equilibrium at the end mean a happy ending. Instead, it means a transformation. So this is the next point to make in this particular discussion, that by going from equilibrium to disequilibrium to a different kind of equilibrium, a film exhibits and presents continuous transformation. And what is it that gets transformed? What's the central focus of transformation? In most films, it's the character, or more usually the characters, but often with a lead character or a set of leading characters. So we've got continuous transformation where the equilibrium is disrupted, the world of the characters is thrown into a disturbed state, and then a different kind of equilibrium is achieved at the end of the film, providing a satisfying sense of closure of this particular story.